welcome to the Quillette Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on.
It's such a pleasure to have you on, and it's such an extraordinary book. It's one of the most detailed biographies I think I've ever read, and your subject is also perhaps the most indefatigable person I have read a biography of in I don't know how long.
She's incredible.
And yeah, absolutely extraordinary. Physical courage, determination, resourcefulness for nearly a century and through various dangerous perils and persecutions. And I think it would be nice to begin with you reading a passage from the book. So if you'd like to start there.
Well, this is a little bit just from the preface that kind of sets the scene some. Sitting on the edge of the circular hole cut in the floor of the mighty 4-engine Halifax bomber, her legs dangling down as though she were a child perched on an adult's chair, Zoe risked a vertiginous glance through the hatch. Although there was a full moon, scudding clouds obscured the light. But if she couldn't see the depth below, Zoe could feel it. Hundreds of feet of emptiness. Gripping the reassuringly solid lip of the hatch, she felt a chill from the cold metal run up her arms. Even if she survived the drop, Zoe knew that the Gestapo were hunting for her in the cities of occupied Poland below. Polish women were among the first to take up arms during the Second World War. Around 40,000 would eventually be sworn into the resistance. The women's motivations, their training, false papers and weapons were just the same as those of the men, and the risk they faced was just as fundamental. But female and male experience never entirely overlapped. Volunteers, rather than conscripts, the women had no military status and found themselves perceived as simple, ordinary, and properly unnoticed. Zoe would have none of that. While serving your country, you have to fight, she argued, for women's rights. Moments later, Zoe was shaking with the cold and her own fear and adrenaline, struck by the apparent madness of plunging from relative safety into the abyss. Then she breathed in something of the Polish fields below, the smell of fallen leaves, earthy and damp, of cut potatoes and the dry stalks of grain already harvested. And she smiled. The red light switched to green, and Zoe plunged into the night. For a breathless second she fell like the condemned, abruptly, straight down and with no thought of landing. The sudden acceleration was shocking. Her body tensed, a defensive action that seemed to make her smaller, meaner, like a nut, tight and hard, falling from a tree, like a bomb released from a British bomb bay. Seconds later, a violent jolt. Zoe's static line, the umbilical cord attaching the cover of her parachute to the aircraft hold, had reached full length and yanked out her chute. Relief flooded through her as she heard the silk unfolding, and her mad rush earthwards suddenly halted, as though she had been caught on a celestial peg. Then, with shocking speed, the ground seemed to rise up to meet her.
Thank you so much. That, I think, gives people a flavor of what the book is like throughout. It's written in a very novelistic way. You often employ kind of indirect free thought or sort of limited third-person narration. You write things as if through the eyes of the various characters, and you make us privy to their thoughts and feelings. How much of that was in the sources, and how much of it did you kind of add?
Deduce.
Yes, deduce.
Yeah, well, pretty much it's all in the sources. One of the fantastic things I found when I started this book, I had no idea who this woman was. I went out to Poland actually in between lockdowns during COVID as my first trip out to see just if there was anything, if there was enough to investigate, let alone write a short story. And there is a huge amount of material in Poland. So there are, for example, I met a man who had recorded her. He had been a journalist in the 1980s and he had recorded an interview with her. And it was amazing because he said, do you want to hear her voice? And
Yes.
he put this tape into his tape deck in an archive. And suddenly I could hear her sort of shouting and laughing and choking up a bit at times. And then the tape came to an end in the interview and there was a click and then this martial music blared out. And I said, Andrew, I'm so sorry. What's this music? I didn't think you were kind of a marching band kind of guy. And he said, well, I recorded her in the 80s. in the communist period, and it was actually illegal to record interviews with people like her who were considered seditious by the communist regime. So he had not been able to get blank tapes, and he'd put, you used to be able to put sellotape over the tab of a tape and record on top. Well, he had got the most good quality tapes he could find, which are actually the tapes of the regime. So he had literally recorded the testimony of this freedom fighter over the propaganda of the regime. And it was 27 taped interviews with her. So you really do get a feel of somebody's character. And she recounts anecdotes, things that she told to friends just after the war. And it was absolutely a goldmine. And that was just one of the sources. She also kept her own archive after the war because the narrative of the war was being rewritten. And so one of her many, many achievements. I mean, she also saved the lives of thousands of women. But after the war, one of her achievements was just to record this history, this factual history through many, many interviews. So I was incredibly lucky with my sources, yeah.
Yeah. So I remember you said at one point when you were talking about those interviews at the end that young man in Poland did with her, that when she listened to the tapes and found herself that she was going to be the center of the story, and it really hit home to her, she didn't want him. She wanted him to stop writing the biography. And I can't remember the exact wording, but you say something like, he realized that what she wanted was the story of all of the women, all of the fighting women to be told, rather than her own story. And I was quite struck after reading the book. I read the blurb at the very end, and I'm always very critical of the blurbs of books that I have already read, but and I'm sure you didn't write this blurb, and I'm not blaming you, but it says, the incredible story of the Second World War resistance fighter. I'm not going to attempt to say her full name in
Elżbieta
Polish.
Zawacka. But yeah, Elżbieta Zawacka, but we all call her Zoe.
Elżbieta Zawacka. I'm going to call her Zoe.
Perfect.
The only woman to reach London as an emissary of the Polish Home Army Command, the only female member of the Polish elite special forces, the Silent Unseen, the only woman to parachute to Nazi-occupied Poland. Now Clare Mulley brings his forgotten heroine back to life. And all of those things are true. And her individual story is really startling because she was, I guess, the most extreme, the most, I keep reaching for this word, indefatigable. I can't think of a better word. The most determined and brave of a number of women who were involved in the Polish War. But in fact, there were many more women directly involved in the war than I had ever realized. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. In fact, this story, what I've done, it is a biography of Zoe. She is the narrative thread that we follow. And her character is, she is so resolute. She's so resilient. She's so determined. I think she's quite funny at times as well, which was good. Humour, of course, can help us through the darkest of times. But it does also weave together the stories of about 6 of her very close comrades in the war. So people like Emilia Malesa, who started off as her boss, became a very good friend, who is quite a good foil for Zoe. She shows a very different type of woman. She's a very flirtatious. She loves the men. She loves fashion. She's got a different angle on things. So she brought quite a lot of colour, but she also had great determination, and she was terribly betrayed. And then there are women like Dr. Zofia Franio, who was a medical doctor. Again, incredible. And what they've all share is this great courage and this resilience and quite a lot of luck for much of the time as well. But Zofia Franio also ends up leading women in bomb sabotage teams. They called them the bombs, these women. And they could go around and, blow up the side of a house or detonate someone. And there were assassination teams as well. And I've brought them all in through different characters. There's a couple of the senior men that Zoe worked with as well, like Rum, who's this extraordinary, fantastic character who she meets in London, and they rub up pretty badly. And he tries to flirt with her in St. James's Park. It's all quite amusing. But they end up fighting side by side. There were huge numbers of women in Poland who served in what was called the Home Army, which was this big national resistance force. The Polish resistance started with lots of different fledgling independent groups and were pulled together and burnished into this extremely organised movement. They actually had a whole underground state with law courts and a university and a printing press, and also had its armed forces part, which was called the Home Army. as opposed to the Polish armed forces overseas. And there were tens of thousands of women in the Home Army. And in fact, one of Zoe's great achievements was that towards the end of the war, she secured the legal representation of women as soldiers in the Polish resistance Home Army, which meant that after the Warsaw Uprising, the women who had been caught weren't just shot as commandos or bandits. It's the only time that Nazi Germany ever set up prisoner of war camps for women, because these women were now protected as soldiers under the Geneva Convention. So in that way, as well as everything else she did, she helped to save the lives of thousands of women. We think 12,000 women served in the Warsaw Uprising alone. So yeah, it was revelatory researching this.
Yeah, she was absolutely obsessed with the topic of securing recognition, military recognition for women who'd fought, right? She was still writing about them and trying to get and make sure that they were honored in retirement or posthumously right up into her 90s.
Yeah, she never stops. She's at galleon in full sail. She goes
Yeah.
ploughing into the war, one of the very first women to serve in the war from 5 o'clock in the morning on the very first day of the war. She steps into action and she doesn't stop. Even after the end of the war, she still continues because, of course, while in the West we got peace and freedom, in Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe, they got a sort of peace and no freedom at all. Poland was left with a Soviet-imposed communist regime that then started rounding up key resistance leaders and executing them for fear that they might lead resistance against the authoritarian regime. So she keeps fighting all of her life, yeah. And she makes it.
Yeah.
She helps to bring freedom and democracy.
At one point, she has been imprisoned by the Soviets and she spends a year in solitary or almost entirely in confinement. It's a horrific period, and she says she's released out to a slightly better prison with a more relaxed regimen, and she begins teaching the other prisoners and then the guards. And at one point she remarks, well, it wasn't so bad being in prison because it gave her time to do some productive stuff. It's just extraordinary.
Look at the bright side, right? Yeah, I mean, one of the most extraordinary interviews I did was with one woman who had shared her prison cell, who'd been younger than Zoe, herself a teenager when she was arrested for mobilizing within her school. And yeah, she was wonderful, describing how Zoe, a lot of these younger women had missed, because of the war, they'd missed 6 years of education. Then they'd been arrested in the post-war years. And a lot of them couldn't write. Couldn't do basic mathematics. So Zoe used to teach them, in the kitchens, they'd cut prints into potatoes and do printing. They would write on the steam of windows and all sorts of different ways. She was using this sort of paste powder they had for their teeth to make a kind of material to write with. And she taught them. And soon she'd organize classes and they were doing quite high level stuff because they had older women who had experience in science and all sorts of different areas. So she set up all of these classes and eventually they began running these classes officially in the prisons. I nearly said in the universities. It's basically a prison university. So yeah, she is, and it wasn't just the practical things, obviously very important to learn your basic maths and your reading and writing. But it was also, she gave them all this spirit of self-respect. She gave them back a reason to keep living. And before she arrived, we know that the suicide rates were quite high. Women would take the lime or leap if they had the opportunity from a window. And that completely changed after she went in there. So she was this incredibly powerful, charismatic, inspirational force for good.
Before we talk a bit more because I want to talk a bit more about the specific situation in Poland, which is quite extraordinary, but I would like to read this passage because I want to give people a little bit more of a sense of the tone of the book. And this is when she's actually in London on a mission to the Polish government in exile. And she's very frustrated to find that the Polish government in exile are all these kind of bureaucrats who are working 9 to 5 and value the getting off at 5 and having their gin and tonics. And I think at one point she says that that's what men were like. Men are just not very hardworking or efficient. She butts up against this Rum, who you mentioned earlier, who kind of assumes that she has some assumptions about what women are like, even though he knows that she has been a courier, a resistance agent, and I'm going to just read this little passage. Rum was used to praise from his bosses, admiration from his colleagues, and appreciation from women. He found Zoe's lack of deference, indeed her lack of any apparent interest in him at all, perplexing and deeply vexing. I wanted so much, even if only for an instant, to see Zoe as a woman, he confessed. My ambition was piqued. Out of bachelor's long-standing habit, I did my best to draw her into some semblance of flirtation. It was late May 1943. Most of the cherry blossoms had fallen, but London's parks were full of the scent of bluebells, the sound of birdsong, and all over the lawns, Rum noticed, American soldiers sat tightly clasping their female companions. Hoping that after office hours, her femininity would assert itself, he decided to launch a charm offensive. The very concept of office hours offended Zoe. While working through the night with Amelia and Mariana in Warsaw, she had imagined the London team also at their desks. Now, she realized, the men were like clerks, working 9 to 5 and drinking tea. That's the way it is with men, she concluded. They are not as focused on duty as women. Women have a different attitude to work. Rum was now fully focused on Zoe. Once he was happy that, quote, the lush green foliage and the atmosphere all around us were most conducive to romance. He produced some silk stockings from his pocket like an amorous magician and tried to lead the conversation onto topics suggested by the picturesque scenes. Her reaction, he wrote, was startling. Abruptly stopping in her tracks, Zoe turned to stare at Rum. It took her a moment to process his overtures. He was having some trivial conversation, some flirting, she realized, while I still had the tragedy of occupied Poland in my mind. Aegon, her brother, had died in Auschwitz, and here he is, talking to me about stockings. His natural self-assurance cracking like an eggshell beneath the impact of her scowl, Rum tried to fill the awkward silence by pointing out that all English ladies wore stockings, and that Zoe's bare legs were not elegant. The only women wearing silk stockings in Poland were the wives of German officers. But instead of being dragged into a debate about nylons, Zoe launched into a spirited lecture on the future role of Poland in liberated Europe. It's a very typical interaction for her.
Yeah, I mean, I should just say that Zoe is not anti-man. I mean, that's a very specific passage, and it is, I mean, I found it very enjoyable to write. I mean, luckily, I managed to find Rum's son, who up in his attic had a whole file of Rum's memoirs, letters to his wife that had contained, and Rum had a very good way with words, so it made a very entertaining passage for me to write. And,
Yes.
it is part of the history, but it is also just one moment. I think, I mean,
Yeah,
first of all, the female and male experience are very different. The men have been trained. Men like Rum had not ever served in the clandestine fight. He was a brilliant officer. He'd served in the defense of Poland in uniform. Poland, of course, is invaded twice at the start of the war, on the 1st of September from the west by Nazi Germany, and just 17 days later, they're invaded again from the east by the Soviet Red Army. Under a secret protocol that had been prearranged. And at that point, Poland knew they couldn't continue to fight effectively on two fronts. So they took the decision to evacuate their armed forces, their government and treasury and so on, first Enigma codebreakers, south out of the country to regroup in France. And Zoe actually kept that route open through a city then called Lviv, now called Lviv, of course, in Ukraine. So a lot of the men had got out, and Rum was one of them. He served in France, then he got to Britain, and then he was sent to London to do this work he didn't really want to do. He wanted to be back in the front line, so he was pretty angry anyhow. Zoe had stayed in the country and had fought behind enemy lines, so she had this understanding of what life was like in occupied Poland that Rum had no experience of. He kind of had imagined, as I think many people did, that occupied territory probably wasn't certainly wasn't nearly as brutal as the reality. Maybe it was a bit like London or something. You know, in Paris, when they occupied France, Zoe has to cross through Paris at one point, and she's amazed to see the German officers walking around with Baedekers, with guidebooks, to enjoy, like a tourist, this beautiful city of Paris. Well, Warsaw was a truly beautiful city as well, but it was just completely demolished. You know, the occupation was incredibly brutal. And Rum had no experience of that. You know, the female and male experience doesn't quite overlap, and they bring these different things together. And of course, women were volunteers, and they had to fight to get to the positions they were in. So they were used to having a fighting outlook. They had all of these motivations bundled in them. Whereas Rum was doing his duty, his job that, he'd been an officer before the war, he was continuing. So it's a very different perspective they're coming from. But the two of them end up working very closely together, sorting out problems with this courier route. And eventually they serve side by side in the open battle in the Warsaw Uprising. So they actually end up with a lot of respect for each other.
You say at one point that in Poland, the home front immediately became the front line. So the kind of experiences of women that I am used to thinking about in the Second World War are the experiences of women in the Blitz, in the Fannies, who you also mentioned, who get a lot of airplay in your book. But the Polish situation was completely different. And in fact, through the course of Zoe's life, as she was born in Prussian-occupied Poland.
Annexed, yeah.
Yeah, and they had to, when she was growing up, they were not allowed to speak Polish, and her mother did speak Polish with them at home and taught them Polish lullabies and things, and she thought of herself as secretly Polish, but they had regular inspections to make sure the children were speaking German with each other, even at home. And so she and her siblings grew up under German occupation. And then there was a brief period of free Poland. Then the Nazis, then there was the massacre at Katyn. There was also the Nazi invasion. And as the Nazis were leaving during the Warsaw Uprising, the Soviets were waiting to come in. And what I hadn't fully realized is just the depth of the kind of betrayal of the Poles by the World War II allies. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a massive, massive and controversial area. I mean, Poland, I think we are very poor at remembering both the contribution and the outcome from Poland during the war. Poland's underground resistance was one of the largest resistance forces and certainly the most organized in occupied Europe. The Warsaw Uprising, their great act of defiance to try and liberate their capital city, was the largest organized uprising, popular uprising against occupation forces. And Poland, of course, was the first country invaded at the start of the war, invaded on two sides by two different armies. But unlike some countries, Poland never conceded. They never collaborated. They didn't have a collaborationist government. They moved their government along with their armed forces outside. It set up in France after the fall of France. It moved from Angers to London. And they were a very important ally earlier on. And the amount of their contribution is very significant. The Polish pilots that served in the Battle of Britain, the two squadrons that got the highest number of kills, were the two Polish squadrons. They had a different technique. They would wait and get in closer, also a very dangerous technique. They served in Tobruk. They served at Monte Cassino. They were very important I mean, the intelligence war, the amount of intelligence we got through Poland, let alone the fact that it was their mathematicians who first broke the enigma. So, a massive contribution. But throughout the war, in a sense, their importance to the Allies becomes eroded. At first it's Britain and Poland and France for a moment. But in June 1941, Hitler made this terrible error, one of many, in invading Soviet-held territory in Europe. And Stalin couldn't believe it. It was actually a woman who smuggled the microfilm with evidence of preparations for Operation Barbarossa, this was called, over to Churchill's desk, and Churchill got in touch with Stalin on the basis, but Stalin didn't believe that Hitler would do that and didn't take remedial action. But that was Christina Skarbek. But yeah, so Hitler betrays Stalin, and so Stalin changes sides pretty rapidly and joins the Allies, which puts the Poles in this terrible position because now they've got the forces of Russia, much larger forces than their own, as an official ally, but they know damn well they were invaded by the Red Army just 2 years earlier, or 18 months earlier. So there's that. And then at the end of 1941, of course, we have Pearl Harbor, and America comes into the war, bringing their huge resources, courage, determination, their young men's lives as well to the Allied side. And Poland's importance is diminished again. So by the end of the war, you have what we call the big three, Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin, negotiating at a set of conferences what post-war Europe will look like, who gets to have their influence where. And by this point, Poland is not even invited to the table, which is dreadful. And even Churchill, I don't feel it had that much authority then. Really, the big two were Roosevelt and Stalin at that point. And so these discussions go on. And of course, eventually, as we know, Poland, arguably the first among the Allies, ends up as member of the victorious Allied nations who had given so much and contributed so much, but ends up without their freedom. They end back with the tyranny of a Soviet-imposed regime that then goes along and arrests, executes, or just disappears thousands, tens of thousands of resistance leaders in a way to subdue the country to their authoritarian rule. So, I mean, it's a desperately sad story. But of course, the Poles keep fighting in various different ways, and eventually with solidarity. And I was lucky enough to interview Lech Wałęsa, the first democratically elected president of Poland, who remembered so. Yeah, she helped with that solidarity movement to finally bring freedom and democracy to her nation.
Yeah, you have some extraordinary accounts in the book of people who had been liberated from Nazi concentration camps and were then imprisoned by the Soviets, tortured, even executed. Just absolutely extraordinary. And I'm going to read a tiny little bit of this. Is I think from the Warsaw Uprising, or from during the Nazi occupation. Behind their advancing line, the German anti-insurgent corps enacted a new terror policy. All Home Army officers were to be shot, irrespective of whether they had surrendered. And Himmler had specified that the part of the population not fighting, women and children, should likewise be killed. Moving from house to house, breaking down doors, throwing grenades into cellars and setting fire to buildings as they went, the special units herded residents into the streets, where they were shot in the head with small firearms or mown down by machine guns. An estimated 40,000 people were murdered on one day alone. Some of their bodies were burnt, others were left where they fell, soldiers in their armbands and children in summer clothes and ankle socks, their limbs akimbo, often with young women beside them, hair in the dirt. Their suddenly still faces looked strangely unconcerned. I'm just missing a small part here, but the Russians are waiting behind the eastern border, close to the border, but Stalin had plans to annex much of eastern Poland and to control the rest. In July, Russian radio had accused the Poles of passivity and collaboration. But once Bohr had launched the uprising, he is the leader
Commander-in-Chief.
Commander-in-Chief of the Polish resistance, the Kremlin ignored Polish attempts to make contact and ordered a halt to their own advance. They stopped about 12 miles short of the war zone. One Fanny with the Polish squadrons later recalled in anguish, and let them all be slaughtered. It suited Stalin to have the Germans decimate the Home Army, thereby eliminating many who might later resist Soviet influence. Jan, glued to the airwaves, even heard Russians describing the uprising, this is the Warsaw Uprising, as a crime whose instigators should be brought to justice. Just extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, it's an absolutely horrific betrayal by the Soviet leadership and the Red Army. Insurgents, that passage is taken from the Warsaw Uprising. The insurgents at the top of the remaining, those office blocks, tower blocks that hadn't yet fallen in Warsaw, could see the Soviets encamped on the far side of the river, just waiting for them, because it didn't serve Stalin's purposes to come in and aid their allies. At this point, better for his long-term goals to let them fight it out with the Germans and be decimated and demoralized. And then he said eventually, after the Germans finally do extract Polish surrender, the Poles thought it would last 2 days, but they had prepared and stockpiled weapons and food supplies and things to keep them going for 2 weeks. But they actually fought on courageously for 2 months with horrendous casualties, as you mentioned there. I mean, the absolute brutality of Hitler's response, his direct commands to just decimate man, woman, child, just dreadful. There are 2 boroughs of Warsaw where everyone was just murdered. But yeah, so then the Allies, I mean, the Warsaw Uprising was timed so that it launches on the 1st of August 1944. So we've had Allied forces coming in from the West since D-Day, of course, in June. And when they take Italy, it is far closer for them to send supplies over to the resistance. So they would fly over from places like Monopoly in Italy and drop canisters of supplies, largely weaponry, but also other supplies as well, radio contact and various things. And even then, Stalin refused to let these Allied planes fly over Warsaw into the land on the far side in the east that he held, meaning they couldn't refuel there. So these aircraft had to fly in, incredibly brave air crews, had to fly in with double the amount of fuel. They're basically flying petrol cans. And that meant they couldn't take so many supplies to drop down as well. So Stalin was hindering in all these ways that didn't even require his forces to go into direct engagement. He still managed to find ways to block and hinder the resistance. And then after Warsaw has fallen, according to the Geneva Convention, the women as well as the men, because Zoe has got the women status as soldiers, military status, are marched out and they're sent to prisoner of war camps. And Zoe could have gone with them actually, but she stays. She's got last order, so she keeps up the fight all the way through. I won't do that one now. But only then does the Red Army come in to what they say is to liberate Warsaw. But really, they just come and occupy the ruins. That's it. So yes, it's a hideous betrayal. It is really interesting. I think it's impossible to talk about this stuff without thinking about the resonances today. The first city that Zoe served in to defend was this city, Lvov, now called Lviv, which she was making petrol bombs, she was digging trenches, anti-tank trenches and so on, supplying the anti-aircraft nests. That city was, of course, invaded from the west by Nazi Germany, but on the 17th of December, by Soviet forces coming in. It's the same city, Lviv, that has seen a Russian force come in very recently. And the excuses given were the same. It was to protect the ethnic Russian population in that land area. Well, that's what was said in 1939. And then you get the great betrayal by Stalin and the Soviet Union later on in the war. And it was really fascinating when I was writing and researching this history to find so many resonances with what's going on today.
Yeah. So this, the book doesn't focus very much on Jewish Poles, although you do talk about how many of Zoe's friends and colleagues sheltered Jewish people in their houses, and also some of them were later honored as righteous among the nations at Vad Yashem. So I'm getting kind of emotional. But also Hitler considered the Jews to be an inferior race and the Poles to be an inferior race. And Polish people in the concentration camps had a P stitched onto their uniform. Yeah, one thing that I think sometimes gets forgotten is that one of the most horrific atrocities of this period was committed by the Soviets in Poland. The massacre in the forest at Katyn, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong.
No, you're perfect. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think we need to have a sliding scale of atrocities. The most appalling atrocities were the death camps. And you cannot write a history of this era in this place without talking a little about the Jewish story. Of course, it's hugely important. And all of these stories are interwoven. So, yeah, I talk a little about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which was the Jewish ghetto uprising, another incredibly valiant and impressive uprising. And Zofia Franio, who I mentioned earlier, she was helping to supply weapons into the ghetto for those fighters. Incredibly tragic bit of history. Some of the information that Zoe brings to London, she has this extraordinary journey. In 1943, she's appointed as an emissary of the commander-in-chief of the Polish resistance, and she has to cross nearly 1,000 miles of enemy-occupied territory to go from Warsaw to London with 2 very important microfilm and 2 missions to undertake in London. And one of these microfilm, it's all military intelligence, troop movements and so on, weapons, V1s, factories where they're being made, all that sort of stuff. And the other one has got information on it about the Holocaust, about particularly Auschwitz, which of course was in Nazi German occupied Polish territory, that German camp. But also the ghettos and information about resistance links across Europe and so on. So, of course, these histories are intertwined, but I really wanted to, this book focuses on the Polish resistance, and it's a biography of one woman. So it's focused around her story, which is, of course, also extremely important and I think much forgotten.
You talk about, I think, the only person to have voluntarily gone to Auschwitz in order to investigate conditions there and help people to escape. Can you tell us a little bit about that story? Yes.
Yeah, it's a man called Witold Pilecki. It's an incredible man. He actually wrote his own memoir just after the war called The Volunteer. And he was requested by the Polish resistance. They knew a little of what was happening in Auschwitz. They had some suspicions, but they didn't really know the half of it. So there were various roundups quite a lot of the time in different parts of Warsaw. They wanted people for labor, they wanted people for hostages, really, and they wanted people to, they wanted all Jewish people to be murdered. So they're constantly doing these roundups. And he actually makes his way deliberately to an area where there's a roundup going on to be arrested and sent himself into Auschwitz. And he's got secretly hidden in these incredibly clever little places parts to help make a radio. And he's got connections with the resistance. They work out where he's going. So he actually helps to set up a resistance inside Auschwitz. I have to say, Auschwitz was divided. There was a Jewish section of Auschwitz, which was even harsher and more closely guarded. And there was a non-Jewish section. He's not Jewish, so he's in the non-Jewish section, but setting up resistance there. And he was sent to work in the woodworking workshops, making whatever the camp needed. And there he met Zoe's cousin, Stanisław, who had been already sent there. And so her cousin was very inspired by Pilecki, and Pilecki, incredibly, not only helps to set up the resistance and help organize the prisoners in there and helps with communications. He then he manages to escape Auschwitz himself. And her cousin, Zoe's cousin, is so inspired. A year later, it takes him a further year, but he and two friends also managed to escape from Auschwitz and then rejoins the fighting forces of the resistance. It's just remarkable. There's a great book on Witold Pilecki, if people are interested, using not only his own memoirs, of course, but some other material by Jack Fairweather. It's called The Auschwitz Volunteer.
Yeah, incredible. You talk about other people in the book as well who, having just been released from the camps, immediately join the fighting forces of the resistance. Just kind of an amazing thought.
And a lot of people are so exhausted, it takes some while to get their health and strength back. But the spirit is there, and there are people, as quickly as possible, they rejoin the ranks. And that, Zoe's cousin is one of those. It's really extraordinary.
Yeah, incredible. One thing that I very much liked about the book is that you don't focus on Zoe's kind of personal identity. You don't make an identity politics thing out of this. And for example, you note that she, as far as we know, she had no romance in her life, or she claims she never had any romance. She clearly had strong affectionate feelings for some of her female colleagues in the war, but it's unclear of what nature or what the relationship was or not. And I'm kind of happy that you don't go there, that
I would never
think it's what Zoe would have wanted. Yeah, exactly. I don't think she would have wanted
she was often asked about her romances, and the most she would give away is that she got on very well with Gilbert, this man who she escapes over the Pyrenees with while being shot at in the freezing mountain passes. So there is that sort of slight hint, but I mean, it's very clear that I think her most intense relationships were with women that she was serving alongside, thrown together in these circumstances of, appalling threat to life, long hours working together. It was, of course, they were very close bonds between them. And she does say when one of her friends dies during the war, and she's forbidden from going to the funeral service because the Germans are watching. They knew that she was her friend was in the resistance, so they're watching to see who will go. So the resistance headquarters bans her, prohibits her from going to the funeral. And she says, I couldn't even go to the funeral of the person that meant more to me than anyone in the world. So you get this sense of her emotions run deep, but she didn't wear them on her sleeve. And I wanted to respect that. So I leave the question open. As you say, it may well have been that she had relationships with women. She may have had a relationship with Gilbert. At the end of the day, we don't know, and I'm not going to presume.
It doesn't seem important, given the importance of the events that are happening in the book, also given the depth of her passion for liberty and freedom for Poland. It feels kind of trivial.
Yeah, I think she was driven above all by her deep, deep patriotism. As you say, she'd been born in Prussian annexed part of Poland. She had only regained her Polish identity, her sense of herself, when she was a young teenager at the end of the First World War. She I mean, like many Poles, she had this generations of inheritance of knowing that their country had centuries of being invaded and annexed and occupied by very aggressive neighbours, but also this pride in Polish defiance and resistance and liberation. And she carried that torch. That was hugely important to her. She is also a feminist, and that's this other twin passion of hers. She said, we have to fight for women's rights as well. Women's rights to serve in their defence of their nation alongside their brothers, their husbands. She's very keen to see women judged as people, not just as ladies. And she judges everyone on the same. We were talking earlier about the way she responds to men. She has a lot of respect for a lot of men, but she has no respect for men that don't deserve it just because they are men. And it's the same with women. There are women she gets on brilliantly with and works alongside to great effect. And there are others who she has a very different relationship with. So she's an individual.
She respects competence, I think you say at one point.
Yes, absolutely. Zoe is one of the very first women to serve in the Second World War. She was shaken awake by the force of an explosion in the early hours of the 1st of September, which was actually by the Luftwaffe coming in and bombing the airbase where she was staying. She was staying at an airbase because she was already a member of the Polish Female Military Auxiliary. So she was uniformed. They weren't part of the Polish Armed Forces because women in Poland couldn't carry weapons and be within the Polish Armed Forces, which seems ridiculous. I have to say it's exactly the same in Britain. That's why we have the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, the Fannies. They sat outside the official armed forces and could carry and use arms. And so she's in the sort of Polish equivalent to that. And she serves immediately in the defence of Lviv. But when Polish forces pull out to regroup in France and continue the fight outside their country, she stays to help support the fledgling Polish resistance. The first thing she volunteers to do is to set up a military intelligence gathering network, which she does across Silesia. It's an area about the size of Wales, but more strategically important at that point, it borders Poland. So the movement of troops coming through there obviously is hugely important to the resistance to know what's happening next, but also to the Allies. There's all sorts of other information they can glean. She recruits, we know within a month she had 200 people, all of them women, actually, because women were serving as secretaries and translators and office cleaners, working in the telephone exchange so they could eavesdrop, look at the tables with maps on whatever. But also women who just worked in laundrettes who could see which uniforms are coming through to be washed in what numbers and what ranks and what divisions. And all of that information taken across a large region like that was very valuable. So she's running this, but she realizes that none of that information is any good at all unless she can get it to the Polish headquarters in Warsaw. So she volunteers what is at this point one of the most dangerous roles, to smuggle that information, to serve as a courier. So she will hide information at first, just as a little slip of paper in the back of a clothes brush that she carried with her. But soon the Poles get very organized and they're doing microfilming. So she carries microfilms in the shaft of a key, a door key, in a little cigarette lighter, all sorts of places. And soon, within a couple of years, she's one of their most experienced couriers. We know she's crossed wartime borders over 100 times. When she stopped counting, she thought it might be unlucky to keep counting, so she stopped counting, but she kept going. And then they realized that she's got these other skills because she was born in Prussian annexed historic Polish territory. She has learnt to speak fluent German. And so here she is. She's got great experience as a courier. She's got fluent German. She's never going to be caught out on a German custom or tradition because she grew up with all of that. And so they start sending her on the most dangerous route of all, which is to go from Warsaw with microfilm into the heart of the Third Reich, into Berlin itself, because they have a friendly contact at an embassy in Berlin, in a neutral embassy, who can then send it out in his diplomatic papers in his post. So that's the fastest way to get information to London. And so she's doing this incredible journey, smuggling information right into Berlin and then bringing back, hidden perhaps in the lining of her suitcase, thousands of dollars to bring back to the resistance and new orders. And then, I mean, I can't do all the stories now, but there are so many close shaves. She's a hair's breadth from being captured by the Gestapo or the SS on numerous occasions. And at one point, she has to leap from a moving train in the middle of the night. Just terrifies me. But she gets away, but she knows she can't continue to work on those routes when her name and face are put on the wanted list in train stations around Warsaw. So that's the point. She is appointed to be the emissary of the commander of the Polish Resistance Home Army, taking these 2 vital microfilms to London. And she has this extraordinary journey. I have to say it was the greatest fun of a chapter to write because at every step there is high drama. Yeah, she gets thrown out of a window in a hotel into a snowdrift. She gets shot at in the mountain passes. She's nearly drowned hiding in the water tender of a train with the French resistance. It's just this cracking tale. And
It's
eventually
like
she
a
makes it back.
Bond film, that
Yeah, I
chapter.
mean, she's so much better than Bond. You know, she's the real deal. She's the real thing. But this drama is incredible. And eventually she gets to Britain. She undertakes these 2 missions. And then she becomes the only female member of the Polish elite para forces, the Cicho-Ciemni, which means the silent unseen, and the only woman to parachute back from Britain into Nazi German-occupied Poland, where she plays a key role in the Warsaw Uprising. So she's just hits all of these key points during the war. And of course, after the war, just the end of the book, it's mostly a Second World War history, but at the end of the book, of course, Poland is left with this Soviet imposed communist regime, and she keeps doing all she can to serve her nation. And eventually 1951 they arrest her and they actually torture her quite horrifically in prison, but she never breaks, and she's actually freed a few years early after Stalin dies as a bit of a thaw, and she goes straight back in and she is still fighting for Poland's freedom. So it's wonderful that she actually did live long enough to see a democratic, free Poland. It's just it ends up this incredible century of history.
Yeah, it's incredible. May I ask if you talk about towards the end of the book the importance of stories that haven't been told, and
Yes.
you draw an analogy with the famous case of the bullet hole ridden planes, that when planes arrive back from missions, at first people would reinforce all of the parts where the bullet holes were, until they realize that it's the parts where there are actually no holes that are the most vulnerable, because if
there was
they
no
were hit,
holes.
the plane went down. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the holes are always in the wingtips and the tail and the central fuselage. There was no holes in the engines or the cockpit, because if you are hit there, you're not coming back. So perhaps that's where they ought to put their heavy armored plating. Yeah, that analogy, they talk about where are the missing holes. And I felt how important it is that we consider where are the missing stories. And I think when you look at the histories and you do a deep dive into histories that have often been considered marginal, like the female contribution on the front line or behind the front lines in the war in various places, you don't get something called women's history that's right over there, something different to military history or in fact history. It's some sort of subcategory. What you get is a much richer picture and deeper, different insights into the whole story. And I think this book, or I hope this book, does 2 things in that regard. I hope it helps us think about the role, the use, the value, and the abuse of Poland during the war. I think when we think about resistance in the Second World War, we tend to think about France, and there is extraordinary history there, some of which I've also written about, but we're much less good at remembering what was happening in Poland. And the other thing is I hope it helps us remember and rebalance our view on the effectiveness of the women who serve. I think when we think of women in the resistance, and female special agents in particular, I have to say, we tend to focus on their courage, which is correct, sometimes their sacrifice, and yes, we must pay tribute to that, of course. But we also, whenever I see it written out, they're always going, well, she was so beautiful. And honey trap, this idea that they're all Mataharis, and that actually, I mean, women would use anything, right? Every soldier would use everything that they had to get their way. But what we don't tend to talk about is how effective the women were and what their contribution brought to ultimate Allied victory. And I think Zoe was among the most extraordinary of many thousands of women who served in similar roles. And so I'm hoping that this will help us to get a much broader understanding and insightful understanding of the conflict here.
Thank you so much, Claire. I absolutely love the book. It's just, it's beautifully written, it's gripping, and it's the most extraordinary collection of stories. I mean, it's just, it is just an absolutely extraordinary story, both the personal story and the broader stories within which it's embedded. And I'm looking forward to reading your other books, because I know you've written some other books also about the Second World War.
Yeah,
so
one
I'm
touching on the first. Brilliant. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed our interview. Thank you.
Thank you.